On this day in history, August 1st, 527, Justinian I becomes the sole ruler of the Byzantine Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the emperor. Justinian I, born 483, died 565, Flavius Anicius Iostinius, surnamed the Great, the most famous of all the emperors of the Eastern Roman Empire, was by birth a barbarian, native of a place called Taurosium in Illyricum, and was born, most probably, on May 1st, 483, probably of Slavonic parentage. His own name was originally Uprada. Iostinius was a Roman name which he took from his uncle Justin I, who adopted him, and to whom his advancement in life was due. Of his early life we know nothing, except that he went to Constantinople while still a young man, and received there an excellent education, though it is alleged that he always spoke Greek with a barbarian accent. When Justin ascended the throne in 518, Justinian became at once a person of the first consequence, guiding, especially in church matters, the policy of his aged, childless, and ignorant uncle, and soon coming to be regarded as his destined successor. On Justin's death in 527, having been a few months earlier associated with him as co-emperor, Justinian succeeded without opposition to the throne. About 523, he had married the famous Theodora, who, as Empress Regent, was closely associated in all his actions till her death in 547. Justinian's reign was filled with great events, both at home and abroad, both in peace and in war. They must be classed under four heads: his legal reforms, his administration of the empire, his ecclesiastical policy, and his wars and foreign policy generally. On this day in history, August 2nd, 338 BC, a Macedonian army led by Philip II defeated the combined forces of Athens and Thebes in the Battle of Chaeronea, securing Macedonian hegemony in Greece and the Aegean. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. The Battle of Chaeronea, 338 BC. This is of great historical importance as the victory by which Philip definitively established the Macedonian supremacy in Greece. In military history, however, too little is known of its details to give it marked significance. Philip's path into Boeotia was barred by the allied Athenians and Thebans both at the western route from Cytinium to Amphissa, and the eastern pass of Parapotami from Elatia to Chaeronea. Philip first placed himself at Elatia, then, by a ruse of withdrawal, put the defenders of the western route still more off their guard, and, moving from Cytinium by night, debouched into western Boeotia and Amphissa. He was thus on the rear of, but at a distance from the defenders of the eastern pass, who thereupon fell back from Parapotami. But instead of passing eastwards through hilly country, which would have aided the resistance, he switched his army back to Elatia, moved unopposed through the pass of Parapotami, and descended upon the enemy's main army at Chaeronea. Philip placed his 18-year-old son, Alexander, in charge of the left wing, where his best troops faced the redoubtable Thebans, and, after a bitter struggle, gained the upper hand. Meanwhile, he had retired his right wing elastically before the onset of the Athenians, until he had drawn them onto low ground, while he had retired onto a rising slope. Then, suddenly, he had launched a counterstroke and disputed the Athenians. Both the victorious Macedonian wings now converged inwards upon the allied center and crushed it between them. With the overthrow of the Theban army and the annihilation of the famous Sacred Band, the scepter of military as well as the political supremacy passed to the new model army of Macedonia that Philip had created. On this day in history, August 3rd, 1057, Frederick of Lorraine elected as Pope Stephen IX. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Pope. Stephen IX, Pope from August 1057 to March 1058, succeeded Victor II, Gebhard of Eichstadt. His baptismal name was Frederick, and he was a younger brother of Godfrey, Duke of Upper Lorraine, Marquis of Tuscany, by his marriage with Beatrice, widow of Boniface, Marquis of Tuscany. Frederick, who had been raised to the cardinalate by Leo IX, acted for some time as papal legate at Constantinople, and was with Leo in his unlucky expedition against the Normans. He shared his brother's fortunes, and at one time had to take refuge from Henry III in Monte Cassino. 5 days after the death of Victor II, he was chosen to succeed him. He showed great zeal in enforcing the Hildebrandine policy as to clerical celibacy. He died at Florence on March 29th, 1058. On this day in history, August 4th, 1265, as part of the Second Barons' War, the Battle of Evesham is fought, where the army of Prince Edward, the future King Edward I of England, defeats the forces of rebellious barons led by Simon de Montfort, 6th Earl of Leicester, killing de Montfort and many of his allies. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. Evesham gave its name to the famous battle fought on August 4th, 1265, between the forces of Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, and the Royalist army under Prince Edward. As the result of the victory at Lewes, the baronial party was supreme throughout most of England. Only on the Welsh March was the royal cause sustained, and thither de Montfort moved, taking with him the king and Prince Edward. But at Hereford, on May 28th, Edward escaped to join his adherents in the border counties. As a counterbalance, de Montfort enlisted the aid of the Welsh themselves, and took the castles of Monmouth and Usk. Meanwhile, however, Edward and the Royalists had secured all the bridges over the Severn in his rear, Gloucester being the last, and then moved down the west bank against de Montfort, now at Newport. They not only threw him back across the Usk, but frustrated his plan of transporting his army back to England by a successful sea raid with 3 galleys against the ships which he had collected at Newport. De Montfort was thus forced to undertake a roundabout and trying march north through the barren districts of Wales, while Edward, after abandoning the pursuit, fell back to Worcester to hold afresh the Severn against him. A new factor was introduced by the approach of de Montfort's son with an army of relief from eastern England. Placed between 2 opposing armies, closing upon him, if gropingly, Edward showed a real and, for a time, remarkable grasp of strategy. While de Montfort himself was still some distance from the Severn, Edward left Worcester on the evening of August 1st, marched during the night the 30 miles to Kenilworth, where de Montfort's son lay, and, taking the baronial army by surprise in the early dawn, captured and destroyed the bulk of it without resistance. Edward, without delay, countermarched to Worcester, to find that de Montfort himself had meantime ferried his army across the Severn at a point 4 miles south of the town. It was clear that, in ignorance of his son's defeat, he would be moving to join him at Kenilworth. Leaving Worcester once more on the evening of August 3rd, Edward's army moved in 3 columns by different roads, but all converging on Evesham, where they would bar de Montfort's route to Kenilworth. Although the surprise was not so complete as at Kenilworth, it was sufficient to give Edward an initial advantage over a hastily assembled enemy, whose first idea was that the approaching force was his sons from Kenilworth, a delusion fostered by Edward's ruse of displaying enemy banners. Caught in the bend of the river Avon by the converging columns and surrounded on all sides, the old earl attempted to cut his way out of the town to the northward. At first the jury of his assault forced back the superior numbers of the prince, but Simon's Welsh levies melted away and his enemies closed the last avenue of escape. The final struggle took place on Green Hill, a little to the northwest of the town, where the devoted friends of de Montfort formed a ring around the leader and died with him. The spot is marked with an obelisk. On this day in history, August 5th, 1100, Henry I is crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the king. Henry I, born 1068, died 1135, King of England, nicknamed Beauclerk, the 4th and youngest son of William I by his queen, Matilda of Flanders, was born in 1068 on English soil. On his life before 1086, when he was solemnly knighted by his father at Westminster, we know little. He was his mother's favourite, and she bequeathed to him her English estates, which, however, he was not permitted to hold in his father's lifetime. Henry was given an excellent education, of which in later life he was proud. His attainments included Latin, which he could both read and write. He knew something of the English laws and language, and it may have been from an interest in natural history that he collected, during his reign, the Woodstock Menagerie, which was the admiration of his subjects. But from 1087 his life was one of action and vicissitudes, which left him little leisure. Receiving under the conqueror's last dispositions a legacy of £5,000 of silver but no land, he traded upon the pecuniary needs of Duke Robert of Normandy, from whom he purchased, for the small sum of £3,000, the district of Cotentin. He negotiated with Rufus to obtain the possession of their mother's inheritance, but only incurred thereby the suspicions of the Duke, who threw him into prison. In 1090, the prince vindicated his loyalty by suppressing, on Robert's behalf, a revolt of the citizens of Rouen which Rufus had fomented. But when his elder brothers were reconciled in the next year, they combined to evict Henry from the Cotentin. He dissembled his resentment for a time, and lived for nearly 2 years in the French Vexin, in great poverty. He then accepted from the citizens of Domfort an invitation to defend them against Robert of Belesme, and subsequently, coming to an agreement with Rufus, assisted the king in making war on their elder brother Robert. When Robert's departure for the First Crusade left Normandy in the hands of Rufus, 1096, Henry took service under the latter, and he was in the royal hunting train on the day of Rufus's death, August 2nd, 1100. Had Robert been in Normandy, the claim of Henry to the English crown might have been effectually opposed, but Robert only returned to the duchy a month after Henry's coronation. In the meantime, the new king, by issuing his famous charter, by recalling Anselm, and by choosing the Anglo-Scottish princess Edith Matilda, daughter of Malcolm III, King of the Scots, as his future queen, had cemented the alliance with the Church and with the native English, which was the foundation of his greatness. Anselm preached in his favor. English levies marched under the royal banner both to repel Robert's invasion, 1101, and to crush the revolt of the Montgomerys, headed by Robert of Belesme, 1102. The alliance of the crown and church was subsequently imperiled by the question of investitures, 1103 to 1106. Henry was sharply criticized for his ingratitude to Anselm, in spite of the marked respect which he showed to the archbishop. At this juncture, a sentence of excommunication would have been a dangerous blow to Henry's power in England, but the king's diplomatic skill enabled him to satisfy the church without surrendering any rights of consequence, 1106. And he skillfully threw the blame of his previous conduct under his counsellor, Robert of Moulins. Although the Peterborough Chronicle accuses Henry of oppression in his early years, the nation soon learned to regard him with respect. William of Malmesbury, about 1125, already treats Tinchebray, 1106, as an English victory and the revenge for Hastings. Henry was disliked but feared by the baronage, towards whom he showed gross bad faith in his disregard of his coronation promises. In 1110 he banished the more conspicuous malcontents, and from that date was safe against plots of his English feudatories. With Normandy he had more trouble, and the military skill which he had displayed at Tinchebray was more than once put to the test against Norman rebels. His Norman, like his English, administration was popular with the non-feudal classes, but doubtless oppressive towards the barons. The latter had abandoned the cause of Duke Robert, who remained a prisoner in England till his death, 1134, but they embraced that Robert's son, William the Clito, whom Henry, in a fit of generosity, had allowed to go free after Tinchebray. The Norman conspiracies of 1112, 1118, and 1123-24 were all formed in Clito's interest. Both France and Anjou supported this pretender's cause from time to time. He was always a thorn in Henry's side till his untimely death at Alost, 1128, but more especially after the catastrophe of the White Ship, 1120, deprived the king of his only lawful son. But Henry emerged from these complications with enhanced prestige. His campaigns had been uneventful. His chief victory, Bremule, 1119, was little more than a skirmish. But he had held his own as a general, and as a diplomatist he had shown surpassing skill. The chief triumphs of his foreign policy were the marriage of his daughter Matilda to the Emperor Henry V, 1114, which saved Normandy in 1124, the detachment of the Pope, Calixtus II, from the side of France and the Clito, 1119, and the Angevin marriage, which he arranged for his son William Etheling, 1119, and for the widowed Empress Matilda, 1129, after her brother's death. This latter match, though unpopular in England and Normandy, was a fatal blow to the designs of Louis VI, and prepared the way for the expansion of English power beyond the Loire. After 1124, the disaffection of Normandy was crushed. The severity with which Henry treated the last rebels was regarded as a blot upon his fame, but the only case of merely vindictive punishment was that of the poet Luc de la Barre, who was sentenced to lose his eyes for a lampoon upon the king, and only escaped the sentence by committing suicide. Henry's English government was severe and grasping, but he kept good peace, and honorably distinguished himself among contemporary statesmen in an age when administrative reform was in the air. He spent more time in Normandy than in England, but he showed admirable judgment in his choice of subordinate. Robert of Moulins, who died in 1118, and Roger of Salisbury, who survived his master, were statesmen of no common order, and Henry was free from the mania of attending in person to every detail, which was the besettling sin of medieval sovereigns. As a legislator, Henry was conservative. He issued few ordinances. The unofficial compilation known as the Leges Henrici shows that, like the Conqueror, he made it his ideal to maintain the law of Edward. His itinerant justices were not altogether a novelty in England or Normandy. It is characteristic of the man that the exchequer should be the chief institution created in his reign. The eulogies of the last Peterborough Chronicle on his government were written after the anarchy of Stephen's reign had invested his predecessor's good peace with the glamour of a golden age. Henry was respected and not tyrannous. He showed a lofty indifference to criticism such as that of Eadmer in the Histories Novorum, which was published early in the reign. He showed, on some occasions, great deference to the opinions of the magnates, but dark stories, some certainly unfounded, were told of his prison houses. Men thought him more cruel and more despotic than he actually was. Henry was twice married. After the death of his first wife, Matilda, 1080 to 1118, he took to wife Adelaide, daughter of Godfrey, Count of Louvain, 1121, in the hope of a male issue, but the marriage proved childless, and the Empress Matilda was designated as her father's successor, the English baronage being compelled to do her homage both in 1126 and again after the Angevin marriage in 1131. He had many illegitimate sons and daughters by various mistresses. Of these bastards, the most important is Robert, Earl of Gloucester, upon whom fell the main burden of defending Matilda's title against Stephen. Henry died near Gisors on December 1st, 1135, in the 36th year of his reign, and was buried in the Abbey of Reading, which he himself had founded. On this day in history, August 6th, 1284, the Republic of Pisa is defeated in the Battle of Meloria by the Republic of Genoa, thus losing its naval dominance in the Mediterranean. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the islet. Meloria, a rocky islet, surrounded by a shoal almost opposite Leghorn, the scene of two medieval naval battles. The first, on May 3, 1241, was successfully fought by the fleet of the Emperor Frederick II in alliance with Pisa against the Genoese squadron bringing a number of English, French, and Spanish prelates to attend the council summoned to meet at the Lateran by Gregory IX. The second, August 6, 1284, was of higher historical importance, for it accomplished the ruin of Pisa as a naval power. The long rivalry of that city and of Genoa had broken out for the last time in 1282, the immediate cause being the incompatible claims of the two cities to sovereignty over the islands of Sardinia and Corsica. The Genoese, who had the larger and more efficient fleet, sent their whole power, commanded by Uberto Doria, against their enemy. The Pisan fleet, commanded by Podesta Morosini, and his lieutenants Ugolino della Gherardesca and Andreotta Saracino, came out in a single body. It is said that while the archbishop was blessing the fleet, the silver cross of the archiepiscopal staff fell off, but that the omen was disregarded by the Pisans, who declared that if they had the wind they could do without divine help. The victory was decided for Genoa by the squadron of Giacaria, which fell on the flank of the Pisans. Their fleet was nearly annihilated, the Podesta was taken, and Ugolino fled with a few vessels. As Pisa was also attacked by Florence and Lucca, it could not recover. 2 years later, Genoa took Porto Pisano, the port of the city, and filled up the harbor. The Count Ugolino was afterwards starved to death with several of his sons and grandsons in the manner made familiar by the 32nd canto of Dante's Inferno. On this day in history, August 7th, 461, Roman Emperor Majorian is beheaded near the river Iria in northwest Italy following his arrest and deposition by the Magister Militum Ricimer. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the emperor. Majorian, Aelius Valerius Maiorianus, Emperor of the West from 457 to 461. After the deposition of Avitus, Majorian was declared emperor by the regent Ricimer. After repelling an attack by the Vandals upon Campania, 458, he prepared a large force to invade Africa. Having defeated and concluded an alliance with Theodoric the Visigoth, at the beginning of 460 he crossed the Pyrenees for the purpose of joining the powerful fleet which he had collected at Carthagena. The Vandal king Gaiseric, however, succeeded through the treachery of certain officers in destroying the Roman fleet. Majorian thereupon made peace, but his ill success had destroyed his military reputation. A mutiny inspired by Ricimer broke out in Lombardy, and on the 2nd of August 461 Majorian was forced to resign. He died 5 days afterwards, either of dysentery or by violence. Majorian was the author of a number of laws, appended to the Theodosian Code. Of these, the most interesting is that forbidding the use of ancient monuments as quarries for building material. On this day in history, August 8th, 870, as part of the Treaty of Meissen, King Louis the German and his half-brother Charles the Bald partitioned the Middle Frankish Kingdom into two larger east and west divisions. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the treaty. Treaty of Meissen, concluded on August 8, 870, at Meissen, in Holland, between Charles the Bald and his half-brother, Louis the German, by which the kingdom of their nephew, Lothair II, died 869, was divided between them. Charles received a portion of the kingdom of Lothair, afterwards called Lorraine, extending from the mouths of the Rhine to the Toul, together with the town of Besancon, the Lyonnais, the Viennais, the Vivarius, and the Uzeg, while Louis had the cities of Cologne, Trier, and Metz, together with Alsace, the Euquens, and the Varay, i.e., the greater part of the diocese of Besancon. The boundary between the two realms was marked approximately by the valleys of the Meuse and the Moselle, and by the Jura. On this day in history, August 9th, 378, as part of the Gothic War, the Battle of Adrianople is fought, wherein a large Roman army led by the Emperor Valens is defeated by the Visigoths. Valens is killed along with over half of his army. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the battle. This is one of the milestones of military and, in less degree, of political history, for the Roman Empire's barriers against the barbarians were breached so gravely that temporary repair was effected only by the substitution of the forces of destruction, the Goths and the Teutons, for the regular imperial forces, and it also marks the changing relative values of infantry and cavalry. The Visigoths were allowed in 376 to move inside the Roman border to escape the pressure of the Huns. A year later, they revolted, and in 378 the Emperor Valens determined to subdue them. When, August 9th, the attack was made, the main body of the Gothic cavalry was away foraging. Gothic offers of surrender, made to regain time for their recall, failed. The Romans, with the legions in the center, and the cavalry on the wings as customarily, assaulted the Goths' position around the Great Wagenlage, when suddenly the enemy's squadrons appeared on the scene and charged like a thunderbolt against their left flank. The Roman cavalry were swept aside, while the Gothic horse drove the left-wing infantry in upon the center and reserve, the pressure forcing the Romans into a disordered mass which was too dense to allow them to use their weapons. Surrounded on all sides and forsaken by their right-wing cavalry and foot, the Roman main body was massacred, and only after 2/3 of the army had fallen could the survivors break through and follow the retreat of the right wing. That evening the sun set for all time on the glory of the legions. The infantry, who had been the foundation of Roman world power and a 1,000 years era of cavalry supremacy, was ushered in. Henceforth, cavalry became the predominant arm of the Roman army. As reorganized by Theodosius, and 150 years later, during Justinian's revival of Roman power, we find Belisarius, risking battle and achieving victory without waiting for his infantry to arrive on the battlefield. On this day in history, August 10th, 1519, Ferdinand Magellan's 5 ships set sail from Seville to circumnavigate the globe. The Basque second-in-command, Juan Sebastian Elcano, will complete the expedition after Magellan's death in the Philippines. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Magellan fitting out the expedition. Magellan returned to Portugal in 1512. On July 14th of that year, he was raised to the rank of Fidalgo Escuadrero, and in 1513 he accompanied a Portuguese expedition against Azamar in Morocco. The city was taken on August 28th to 29th, 1513, but Magellan was subsequently wounded and lamed for life in a sortie, but was also accused of trading with the Moors. The accusation was subsequently dropped, but Magellan fell into disfavor with King Manuel, who let him understand that he would have no further employment in his country's service after May 15, 1914. Magellan formally renounced his nationality and went to offer his services to the court of Spain. He reached Seville on October 20th, 1517, and then went to Valladolid to see Charles V, with the help of Juan de Aranda, one of the 3 chief officials of the India House at Seville, and of other friends, especially Diogo Barbosa, a Portuguese like himself, naturalized as a Spaniard, who had acquired great influence in Seville, and whose daughter he now married. He gained the ear of Charles, and of the powerful minister, Juan Rodriguez de Fonseca, Bishop of Burgos, the persistent enemy of Columbus, the steady supporter of his great successor. Magellan proposed to reach the Spice Islands of the East Indies by the west. For that purpose, he hoped to discover a strait at the extreme south of South America, and is said to have declared himself ready to sail southwards to 75 degrees to realize his project. Roy Faliero, the astronomer, another Portuguese exile, aided him in working out his plan, and he found an invaluable financial ally in Christopher de Haro, a member of a great Antwerp firm who owed a grudge to the King of Portugal. On March 22, 1518, Magellan and Faliero, as joint captains-general, signed an agreement with Charles V, by which 1/20th of the clear profits were to fall to them. Further, the government of any lands discovered was vested in them and their heirs with the title of adelantados. On August 10, 1519, the fleet of 5 vessels under Magellan's command left Seville and dropped down the Guadalquivir to Sanlúcar de Barramedi, at the mouth of the river, where they remained more than 5 weeks. On September 20th, the Armada put to sea. Of the vessels which composed it, the Trinidad was the flagship, and the Vittoria, the only one which accomplished the circumnavigation. Antonio Pigafetta, of Vicenza, an Italian gentleman who had left the best history of the voyage, went as a volunteer in Magellan's suite. Faliero stayed behind, having cast his horoscope and found that the venture would be fatal to him. Before starting, Magellan made his will and addressed a memorandum to Charles V, assigning geographical positions connected with the controversy he was intending to settle, viz., the proper drawing of a demarcation line between the spheres of Spain and Portugal in the East Indies, and the inclusion of the Moluccas within the Spanish sphere. On this day in history, August 11th, 117, Hadrian is proclaimed Roman Emperor, 2 days after Trajan's death. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the rise of Hadrian. Hadrian, Publius Aurelius Hadrianus, Roman Emperor from 117 to 138 AD, was born on January 24th, 76 AD, at Italica in Hispania Baetica, where his ancestors, originally from Hadria in Picenum, had been settled since the time of the Scipios. On his father's death in 85 or 86, he was placed under the guardianship of 2 fellow countrymen, his kinsman Ulpius Trajanus, afterwards the Emperor Trajan, and Caelus Atanius, afterwards prefect of the Praetorian Guard. He spent the next 5 years at Rome, but at the age of 15 he returned to his native place and entered upon a military career. Trajan sent for him to Rome in 93, and after filling the usual minor civil posts, he started serious military service as a tribune to the 2nd Legion, stationed at Budapest, 95. He spent 4 years on that frontier, being sent to Trajan with the army's congratulations in 97, and returned to Rome with Trajan in 99. In 100, the Empress Plotina arranged a marriage between him and Vibia Sabina, Trajan's great niece. In 101, Hadrian was quaestor. In 105, tribune of the people. In 106, praetor. He served with distinction in both Dacian campaigns. In the second, Trajan presented him with a valuable ring which he himself had received from Nerva, a token of regard which seemed to designate Hadrian as his successor. In 107, Hadrian was legatus praetorius of Lower Pannonia. In 108, consul suffectus, legatus in the Parthenian campaign, 113 to 117. In 117, consul designatus for the following year. In 119, consul for the third and last time, only for 4 months. When Trajan, owing to a severe illness, decided to return home from the east, he left Hadrian in command of the army and governor of Syria. On August 9th, 117, Hadrian at Antioch was informed of his adoption by Trajan, and on the 11th, of the death of the latter at Selinus in Cilicia. Whether he ever was formally adopted cannot be established. The army and the Senate confirmed his succession, and he took office with danger threatening the empire on nearly every side. On this day in history, August 12, 1687, as part of the Battle of Mohacs, Charles of Lorraine defeats the Ottoman Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the village. Mohacs, a Hungarian town on the right bank of the Danube, acts as a market for the vineyards and agricultural produce of the fertile alluvian lands of the district. It also engages in working up of flax, hemp, and wool, milling and brewing. The town is famous in history as the site of 2 fateful battles for the control of the route between the river and the Metshik Mountains. In the first, August 29, 1526, the Turks annihilated the Hungarian army, but in the second, August 12, 1687, they were decisively defeated by the Austrians. Population from 1930, 17,369. On this day in history, August 13, 523, John I becomes the new pope after the death of Pope Hormisdas. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Pope John. John I, Pope from 523 to 526, Tuscan by birth, was consecrated Pope on the death of Hormisdas. Theodoric sent him to Constantinople on an embassy to Justin to secure toleration for the Arians. He was suspected of lukewarmness in his mission and was imprisoned by Theodoric on his return. He died in prison on May 18th. His feast day is May 27th. On this day in history, August 14th, 1592, the first sighting of the Falkland Islands by John Davis. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the conditions on the islands. The Falkland Islands correspond very nearly in latitude in the southern hemisphere with London in the northern. The temperature is equable, the average of the midsummer months being about 47 degrees Fahrenheit, and that of the 2 midwinter months, 37 degrees Fahrenheit. The climate is not unlike that of the Outer Hebrides, but is somewhat colder. Occasional heavy snowfalls occur, and the sea in shallow inlets is covered with a thin coating of ice. The sky is almost constantly overcast, and rain falls, mostly in a drizzle, and in frequent showers, on about 250 days in the year. The rainfall is not great, only about 26 inches, but the mean humidity for the year is high. November is considered the only dry month. The prevalent winds from the west, southwest, and south blow continuously, at times approaching the force of a hurricane. A region more exposed to storms both in summer and winter it would be difficult to mention. Fitzroy, Voyages of Adventure and Beagle, page 228. The fragments of many wrecks emphasize the dangers of navigation, which are increased by the absence of beacons, the only lighthouse being the one maintained by the Board of Trade on Cape Pembroke, near the principal settlement. Of aboriginal human inhabitants there is no trace in the Falklands, and the land fauna is very scanty. A small wolf or dog, the loup renard of de Boinville, is extinct, the last being seen about 1875 on the West Falkland. Some herds of cattle and horses ran wild until recently, but these were, of course, introduced, the first having been brought by de Bougainville. Horses and cattle have declined in numbers, being profitably replaced by sheep, of which there are over 600,000 in 1926. Except for about 80 acres, all land is used for sheep farming, which started in East Falkland in 1835. Land birds are few in kind. However, the snipe and military starling, which on account of its scarlet breast is locally known as the robin. Seabirds are abundant, and, probably from the islands having been comparatively lately peopled, they are singularly tame. Gulls and amphibious birds abound in large variety. 3 kinds of penguin have their rookeries and breed here, migrating yearly for some months to the South American mainland. Stray specimens of the great king penguin have been observed, and there are also mollymawks, a kind of albatross, black-crested grebe, Cape pigeons, and many carrion birds. Kelp and upland geese abound, the latter being edible, and their shooting affords some sport. The Falkland Islands form essentially a part of Patagonia, with which they are connected by an elevated submarine plateau, and their flora is much the same as that of Antarctic South America. The trees which form dense forest and scrub in southern Patagonia and in Fuegia are absent, owing to the strong gales and salt spray, and attempts at planting trees have not been met with great success. The greater part of the camp, the open country, is formed of peat, which in some places is of great age and depth, and at the bottom of the bed very dense and bituminous. The peat is different in character from that of northern Europe. The lower plants enter but little into its composition, and it is formed almost entirely of the roots and stems of Empetrum ruberum, a variety of the common crowberry of the Scottish hills with red berries, called by the Falklanders the diddle-dee-berry, of Mitrus numeralia, a little creeping myrtle whose leaves are used by the shepherds as a substitute for tea, and of sedges and sedge-like plants, such as Astelia pumila, Gaymardi australis, and Boscavia grandiflora. Peat is largely used as fuel, coal being only obtained at a high price. 2 vegetable products, the balsam bog, Azorella caspitosa, and the tussock grass, Poa flabellata, have been objects of curiosity and interest ever since the first accounts of the islands were given. The first is a huge mass of a bright green color, living to a great age, and when dead becoming of a gray and stony appearance. When cut open, it displays an infinity of tiny leaf buds and stems, and at intervals there exudes from it an aromatic resin. The tussock grass is a wonderful and most valuable natural production, which, owing to the introduction of stock, has become extinct in the 2 main islands, but still flourishes elsewhere in the group. It is a reed-like grass which grows in dense tufts from 6 to 10 feet high from stool-like root crowns. It forms excellent fodder for cattle and is regularly gathered for that purpose. The population was estimated at 2,427 in 1933. The large majority of the inhabitants live in the East Island, and the predominating element is Scottish. Scottish shepherds having superseded the South American Guachos. In 1867 there was no settlers on the West Island, and the government issued a proclamation offering leases of grazing stations on very moderate terms. In 1868 all the available land was occupied. These lands are fairly healthy, the principal drawback being the virulent form assumed by simple epidemic maladies. The occupation of the inhabitants is almost entirely pastoral, and the principal industry is sheep farming. Wool farms, by far the largest export, and tallow, hides, bones, and frozen mutton are also exported. Trade is carried on almost entirely with the United Kingdom. The value of exports in 1926 was nearly £240,000, most of which was in wool, and of its imports nearly £180,000. The Falkland Islands Company, having its headquarters at Stanley, and an important station in the camp at Darwin, carries on an extensive business in sheep farming and the dependent industries, and in general import trade. The development of this undertaking necessitated the establishment of stores and workshops at Stanley, and ships can be repaired and provided in every way, a matter of importance in such stormy seas. A former trade in oil and sealskin has decayed, owing to the smaller number of whales and seals remaining about the islands, and the headquarters of the whaling industry has been moved to South Georgia. Communications are maintained on horseback and by water, and there are no roads except at Stanley. Mail leaves for England monthly, passage being about 4 weeks. The Falkland Islands were first seen by Davis in the year 1592, and Sir Richard Hawkins sailed along the north shore in 1594. The claims of Amerigo Vespucci to a previous discovery are doubtful. In 1598, Sebald de Wert, a Dutchman, visited them and called them the Sebald Islands, a name which they bear on some Dutch maps. Captain Strong sailed through between the two principal islands in 1690, landed upon one of them, and called the passage Falkland Sound, and from this the group afterwards took its English name. In 1764, the French explorer de Bougainville took possession of the islands on behalf of his country, and established a colony at Port Louis on Berkeley Sound. But in 1767, France ceded the islands to Spain, de Bougainville being employed as intermediary. Meanwhile, in 1765, Commodore Byron had taken possession on the part of England on the ground of prior discovery, and had formed a small settlement at Port Egmont on the small island of Saunders. The Spanish and English settlers remained in ignorance, real or assumed, of each other's presence until 1769 to 1770, when Byron's action was nearly the cause of war between England and Spain, both countries having armed fleets to contest the Baron's sovereignty. In 1771, however, Spain yielded the islands to Great Britain by convention. The Falkland Islands are a crown colony, with a governor and executive and legislative councils. The colony is self-supporting, the revenue being largely derived from drink duties, and there is no public debt. The Falklands are the seat of a colonial bishop. Education is compulsory. The government maintains schools and traveling teachers. The Falkland Islands Company also maintains a school at Darwin. Stanley was for some years a naval station, but ceased to be so in 1904. It is now a wireless station. On this day in history, August 15th, 778, the Battle of Roncevaux Pass takes place between the army of Charlemagne and a Basque army. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the village. Roncevaux, or in French, Roncevaux, a village of northern Spain, in the province of Navarre, situated on the small river Urubi, at an altitude of 3,220 feet among the Pyrenees, and within 5 miles from the French frontier. Population, from 1930, 150. Roncevaux is famous in history and legend for the defeat of Charlemagne and the death of Roland in 778. The small collegiate church contains several relics associated with Roland and is a favorite place of pilgrimage. The battle is said to have been fought in the picturesque valley known as Val Carlos, which is now occupied by a hamlet. Population in 1930, 951, bearing the same name, and in the adjoining defile of Ibaneta. Both of these are traversed by the main road leading north from Roncevaux to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port in France. On this day in history, August 16th, 963, Nicephorus II Phocas is crowned Emperor of the Byzantine Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the emperor. Nicephorus II Phocas, emperor from 963 to 969, belonged to a Cappadocian family which had produced several distinguished generals. He was born about 912, joined the army at an early age, and under Constantine VII, became commander on the eastern frontier. In the war with the Saracens, he began with a severe defeat, 956, which he retrieved in the following years by victories in Syria. In 960, he led an expedition to Crete, and wrested the whole island from the Saracens. He then returned to the east with a large and well-equipped army. In the campaigns of 962 to 963, he forced his way through Cilicia to Syria and captured Aleppo, but made no permanent conquests. Upon the death of Romanus II, Nicephorus was proclaimed emperor by the eastern troops, and was eventually acknowledged at Constantinople as colleague of the infant son Romanus. In 964 to 966, he definitely conquered Cilicia, and again overran Mesopotamia and Syria, while the patrician Nicetas recovered Cyprus. In 968, he reduced most of the forces in Syria, and after the fall of Antioch and Aleppo, 969, which were recaptured by his lieutenants, secured his conquests by a peace. On his northern frontier, he began a war against the Bulgarians, to whom the Byzantines had of late been paying tribute, 967, and by instigating an attack from the Russians distracted their attention effectively. Nicephorus was less successful in his western wars. After renouncing his tribute to the Fatimite caliphs, he sent an expedition to Sicily under Nicetas. 964 to 965, but was forced by defeats on land and sea to evacuate that island completely. In 967 he made peace with the Saracens of Chaeronea and turned to defend himself against their common enemy, Otto I of Germany, who had attacked the Byzantine possessions in Italy, but after some initial successes, his generals were defeated and driven back upon the southern coast. Owing to the care which he lavished upon the proper maintenance of the army, Nicephorus was compelled to exercise rigid economy in other departments, but his heavy imposts and the debasement of the coinage he forfeited his popularity with the rest of the community, and gave rise to riots. He was finally assassinated in his sleeping apartment by his nephew and successor, John Zimisces. Nicephorus was the author of an extant treatise on military tactics. On this day in history, August 17th, 682, Pope Leo II begins his pontificate. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Pope. Leo II, Pope from August 682 to July 683, was a Sicilian by birth and succeeded Agatho I. The only fact of permanent historical interest with regard to Leo is that he wrote once and again in approbation of the decision of the Sixth Ecumenical Council, Constantinople 681, and in condemnation of the Monothelite heresy and of Honorius, whom he regarded as one who profana proditione immaculatium fidem subverte cantus est. In the Greek text of the letter to the emperor in which the phrase occurs, the milder expression subverti permissit is used for subverte conatos est. This Hefeli, in his Concile enge Schetait, regards as alone expressing the true meaning of Leo. It was during Leo's pontificate that the dependence of the See of Ravenna upon that of Rome was finally settled by imperial edict. Benedict II succeeded him. On this day in history, August 18th, 1487, the siege of Malaga ends with the taking of the city by Castilian and Aragonese forces. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Malaga, the capital of the province of Malaga, an episcopal see and next to Barcelona, the most important seaport of Spain, finally situated on the Mediterranean coast at the southern base of the Axarquia Hills, and at the eastern extremity of the fertile Vega plain of Malaga, in 36 degrees 43 minutes north and 4 degrees 25 minutes west. Population, from 1940, 234,913. The climate is mild and equable, the mean annual temperature being 66.7 degrees. The principal railway inland gives access through Badabudia to all parts of Spain, with a branch line along the coast of Valles Malaga. Malaga is the Malacca of Strabo and Ptolemy, and the Malacca Jordatorium of Pliny. The place seems to have been of some importance even during the Carthaginian period. Under the Romans it became a municipum, and under the Visigoths an episcopal see. In 711 it passed into the possession of the Moors, and soon came to be regarded as one of the most important cities of Andalusia. It was attached to the Caliphate of Cordova, but on the fall of the Umayyad dynasty, it became for a short time the capital of an independent kingdom. Afterwards it was dependent on Granada. In 1487 it was taken by Ferdinand and Isabella after a protracted siege. In 1810 it was sacked by the French. It was captured, February 8, 1937, by the nationalist general Guaipo de Llano. Malaga lies principally on the left bank of the Guadalmedina river of the city. The streets near the sea are comparatively modern and well-built. Suburbs have spread into the rich and pleasant country which surrounds the city. The Plaza de Regio, the Plaza de la Constitucion, and the Peso de la Amedia are important. The cathedral, on the site of an ancient mosque, was begun about 1528. After its construction had been twice interrupted, it was completed to its present state in the 18th century. The Castle Gibralfaro, on a rock to the northeast, dates from the 13th century. New harbor works were undertaken in 1880, and all vessels can load or discharge at the quays, which are connected with the main railway system by a branch line. Iron, lead, wine, olive oil, brandy, almonds, fresh and dried fruit, hats, and canary seed are exported in large quantities. Imports include petroleum, grain, codfish, fuel, chemicals, iron and steel, machinery, and manures. There are large cotton mills, iron foundries, smelting works, and engineering works. The industries include tanning, distilling, and the manufacture of sugar, chocolate, soap, candles, artificial ice, chemical products, white lead, and pianos. On this day in history, August 19th, 1759, the Battle of Lagos is fought, a naval battle during the 7 Years' War between Great Britain and France. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the port. Lagos, a seaport of southern Portugal, in the district of Faro, population 1930, 9,888. The city is defended by fortifications erected in the 17th century. The harbor is deep, capacious, and completely sheltered on the north and west. It is frequently visited by the British Channel Fleet. Vines and figs are extensively cultivated in the neighborhood, and Lagos is the center of an important sardine and tunny fisheries. Its trade is chiefly carried on by small coasting vessels, as there is no railway. Lagos is on or near the site of the Roman Laco Briga. Cape St. Vincent, the ancient Promontorium Sacrum, and the southwestern extremity of the kingdom, is 22 miles west. It is famous for its connection with Prince Henry, the navigator, who had founded the city of Sagres in 1421, and for several British naval victories. In 1759, Admiral Boscawen defeated a French fleet off Lagos. The Great Earthquake of 1755 destroyed a large part of the city. On this day in history, August 20th, 1083, the canonization of the first king of Hungary, St. Stephen, and his son, St. Emmerich, celebrated as a national day in Hungary. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the king. Stephen I, St. Stephen, born 977, died 1038. King of Hungary, was the son of Geza, Duke of Hungary, and of Saralta, one of the few Magyar Christian ladies. His tutors included the German priest Bruno, the Czech priest Radla, and an Italian knight, Theodate of San Servino, who taught him arms and letters. In 996, Stephen married Gisela, the daughter of Duke Henry II of Bavaria. In the following year, his father died, and the young prince was confronted by a formidable pagan reaction between the Drave and Lake Balaton. Stephen hastened against the rebels, bearing before him the banner of St. Martin of Tours, whom he now chose to be his patron saint, and routed the rebels at Veszprém, 998, assuming the royal title immediately afterwards. The rest of Stephen's life was spent largely in a struggle against the pagan nobles, which engrossed his energies and compelled him to adopt a pacific policy towards the emperors of the East and West. But when attacked by the Emperor Conrad in 1030, Stephen repelled the invasion successfully. He died at Esztergom in 1038. And was canonized in 1083. On this day in history, August 21st, 1415, Henry the Navigator leads Portuguese forces to victory over the Marinids at the Conquest of Ceuta. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the port. Ceuta, Arabic Septa, a Spanish military and convict station and seaport on the north coast of Morocco, in 35 degrees, 54 minutes north, 5 degrees, 18 minutes west. Population estimated at 1930, 50,614. It is situated on a promontory connected with the mainland by a narrow isthmus, and making the southeastern end of the Straits of Gibraltar, which between Ceuta and Gibraltar have a width of 14 miles. The promontory terminates in a bold headland, the Montague des Cygnes, with 7 peaks, of which the highest, the Monte del Jaco, the ancient Ablia, one of the Pillars of Hercules, rises 636 feet above the sea. Ceuta occupies in part the site of a Carthaginian colony, which was succeeded by a Roman colony said to have been called Ad Septem Frates, and also Exelisa, or Lyssa Civitas. From the Romans, the town passed to the Vandals and afterwards to Byzantium, the Emperor Justinian restoring its fortifications in 535. In 618, the town known as Septon fell into the hands of the Visigoths. It was the last stronghold in North Africa which held out against the Arabs. At the date, 711 AD, the governor was Count Julian, who, to avenge a family wrong, invited the Arabs to conquer Spain. By the Arabs, the town was called Cibita, or Ceuta, hence the Spanish form Ceuta. It was repeatedly being captured by the rival Berber and Spanish-Moorish dynasties, but became, nevertheless, an important industrial and commercial city, being noted for its brassware and its trade in ivory, gold, and slaves. It is said to have been the first place in the West where a paper manufactory was established. In 1415, the town was captured by the Portuguese. It passed to Spain in 1580 on the subjugation of Portugal by Philip II, and was definitely assigned to the Spanish crown by the Treaty of Lisbon in 1688. The town has been several times unsuccessfully besieged by the Moors, one siege, under Muali Ismail, lasting 26 years, 1694 to 1720. In 1810, with the consent of Spain, it was occupied by British troops, but was restored to Spain at the close of the Napoleonic Wars. As a result of the war between Spain and Morocco in 1860, the area of Spanish territory around the town was increased. Ceuta consists of two quarters, the old town, covering the low ground of the isthmus, and the modern town, built on the hills, forming the north and west faces of the peninsula. Between the old and new quarters, and on the north side of the isthmus, lies the port. The fortifications date from the Portuguese occupation. For civil purposes, Ceuta is attached to the province of Cadiz. It is a free port, but does little trade. On this day in history, August 22nd, 1138, the Battle of the Standard between Scotland and England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. Battle of the Standard, a name given to the Battle of August 22nd, 1138. Near Northallerton, in which the Scottish army, largely composed of wild and undisciplined Highlanders and Galloway Picts under King David, was defeated by the English levies of Yorkshire and the North Midlands. The latter formed a single deep line of dismounted men in front of a chariot, carrying the consecrated banners of St. Peter of York, St. John of Beverley, St. Wilfrid of Ripon, and St. Cuthbert of Durham. King David planned to use his nucleus of knights and archers to lead the way and open a gap in the English line, but the fierce pride of the clansmen compelled him to give them precedence. Their headlong onset was repulsed. Left isolated except for his bodyguard of knights, King David retired from the field. On this day in history, August 23rd, 1268, the Battle of Tagliacozzo marks the fall of the Hohenstaufen family from the imperial and Sicilian thrones, and leading to the new chapter of Angevin domination in southern Italy. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Tagliacozzo, a town of the Abruzzi, Italy, in the province of Aquila, 56 miles by rail east by northeast of Rome, and 10 miles west of Avezzano. Population from 1936, 3,693 in the town, 10,320 in the commune. It lies 2,428 feet above sea level at the mouth of the deep ravine of the Imel. It contains several old churches, notably St. Francesco, with a fine rose window in the facade, and medieval houses. The palace, built at the end of the 14th century by the Orsini, is fine, with interesting paintings in the interior. At the end of 1268, a battle took place here between Conradin of Hohenstaufen and Charles of Anjou, which resulted in the defeat of Conradin. On this day in history, August 24th, 1911, Manuel de Arriaga is elected and sworn in as the first president of Portugal. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the politician. Manuel José de Arriaga, born 1839, died 1917. Portuguese politician, was born in Horta, in the Azores, July 8, 1839. Educated at the University of Coimbra, he was graduated in law in 1866. Arriaga early showed signs of his Republican sympathies, with the result that his father, an ardent royalist, disinherited him, and as a student he was obliged to support himself by coaching his juniors. He had a distinguished scholastic career, among his appointments being the rectorship of the University of Coimbra and a professorship at the Lyceum in Lisbon. His political career opened in 1882 when he was elected Republican deputy for Funchal. From 1890 to 1892 he represented Lisbon. During the Revolution of 1910, He was a prominent figure of the Republican side, and on August 24th, 1911, he was elected first constitutional president of the Portuguese Republic. The Royalist risings of 1911 and 1912 taxed his strength, and in 1915, feeling no longer able to cope with the difficulties of the situation, particularly in the face of the coup d'etat of May 14th, he resigned May 27th. He died March 5th, 1917. His full name was Manuel José de Arriaga Brun de Silveira y Perelón. On this day in history, August 25th, 1270, Philip III, although suffering from dysentery, becomes King of France following the death of his father, Louis IX, during the Eighth Crusade. His uncle, Charles I of Naples, is forced to begin peace negotiations with Mohammed I al-Mustansir, Hafsid Sultan of Tunis. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the king. Philip III, born 1245, died 1285, surnamed the Bold, Le Hardy. King of France, son of Louis IX and Margaret, daughter of Raymond Berenger IV, Count of Provence, was born on April 3, 1245. His funeral monument at Saint Denis depicts a man with beardless, square-cut features, but lacking character and animation. The authenticity of this effigy is fairly well borne out by what is known of him from other sources. He had many of the virtues of St. Louis, but neither decision of character nor devotion to duty. He was pious, charitable, of unimpeachable morality, quick-tempered but placable, no great scholar, and only energetic as a hunter. The absence in him of the qualities that fit a man to rule made his court the arena of intriguing factions, which in reality ruled France in his reign of 15 years. Matthew of Vendôme, abbot of Saint Denis, an old servant of Louis IX, acted as Philip's counselor, so chroniclers state, throughout the reign, but it was probably with administration, and not policy, that Matthew was chiefly concerned. Philip began his reign in 1270 by falling entirely under the influence of Pierre de la Bruze, who had been surgeon and valet de chambre to his father, whom he had made lord, sieur, of Longueuil, Châtillon-sur-Indre, and Damville. His influence lasted until Philip's second marriage in 1274 with Marie, daughter of Henry III, Duke of Brabant. She supplied a centre for the enemies of the favourite, who, in 1278, was charged with various crimes, including one of poisoning the king's eldest son, and hanged at Montfaucon. His death left the parties of Marie, the queen, and Margaret, the queen-mother, to struggle for the mastery. The settlement of the claims of the King of England in Aquitaine by the Treaty of Amiens in 1279 was a victory for the party of Margaret. Agny and southern Santon, which fell to the crown by the death of Alphonse of Poitiers in 1276, as part of his vast possessions in Aquitaine and Languedoc, were ceded to Edward I of England in accordance with the Treaty of Paris in 1259. Another portion of the heritage of Alphonse, the Venaissin, was ceded to the papacy to redeem an old promise. In general, the strong will of Charles of Anjou directed Philip's policy. He secretly urged his nephew's candidature for the imperial crown, left vacant by the death of Richard of Cornwall, King of the Romans, in 1272, but without success. In May 1275, the party of Marie secured for Philip, the king's second son, the hand of Jean, the heiress of Navarre and Champagne, along with the guardianship of the kingdom of Navarre during the minority of Jean. But early in 1276, Jean's mother, Blanche, the widow of Henry III of Navarre and Champagne, married Edmund, 1st Earl of Lancaster, brother of Edward I, and she and her English husband kept Champagne until, in 1284, Jean came of age. An expedition of Philip against Castile in aid of the children of his sister, Blanche, proved abortive. Regardless of this warning, he was induced in 1284 to take up the quarrel of his uncle Charles in Sicily, after the Sicilian Vespers in 1282. 2 assemblies of barons and prelates were held at Bourges in November 1283 and February 1284 to deliberate on the question. This was a mere matter of form. Marie of Brabant and her party had decided the matter beforehand, and the crown of Aragon, which the French Pope Martin IV had declared forfeited by Peter, was accepted for Charles of Valois, Philip's third son. The project was strongly opposed by Matthew of Vendôme, who was in correspondence with the King of England on the subject. It was the first warlike expedition undertaken by the House of Capet outside France. It proved a disastrous failure. Philip died during a retreat from Genoa on October 5, 1285. Philip was twice married. On May 22, 1262, he married Isabella, daughter of James I, King of Aragon, who died in 1271. By her he had 4 children: Louis, who died in 1276, Philip, born in 1268, Charles of Valois, born on March 12, 1270, and Robert, who died young. By his second wife, Marie, died 1322, daughter of Henry III of Brabant, whom he married in 1274, he had 3 children: Louis, Count of Evreux, Margaret, who married in 1299 Edward I, King of England, and Blanche, who married Rudolph III, Duke of Austria. On this day in history, August 26, 1071, the Seljuk Turks defeat the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert and soon gain control of most of Anatolia. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. In the spring of 1071, Romanus Diogenes, the Byzantine emperor, having collected together an army of some 60,000 men, marched into Armenia to recover the fortresses of Aklat and Manzikert, which had been captured by Alp Arslan and his Seljuk Turks. His forces were composite, consisting of Byzantine cavalry and infantry, German mercenaries, and Franks. At Aklat, he divided his army, leaving there a division to besiege the fortress, and with the main body marched on to Manzikert and reduced that place. Hardly had he done so when he fell in with Alp Arslan's advance guard. The Sultan's army was 100,000 strong, and mainly consisted of horse archers. Tactics which the emperor should have employed were those laid down by Leo the Wise, namely, to maintain an unbroken front, to beware of surprise, and never to fight with uncovered flanks or rear. Romanus was a brave soldier, but impetuous. In the advance guard encounter, one of his generals, Basileus, fell into an ambush, losing all of his men. The emperor drew upon his army in front of his camp. The right wing was composed of Asiatic cavalry, the left of European, and the center of Byzantine horse. In rear he drew up a strong second line of Germans and Normans under Andronicus Ducas. As he advanced on his enemy, the Turks refused to close, hovering around the 2 lines and plying them with arrows. In the evening a halt was called, and the emperor, fearing that his camp was in danger, ordered a retirement. This order was misinterpreted, and confusion resulted, whereupon the Turks closing in compelled the emperor to face about. Andronicus refused to halt and retired to camp. The loss of the rear line left the rear of the front line open to attack. Eventually this line was overwhelmed, and Romanus was decisively defeated and made a prisoner. The result of this defeat was disastrous. Asia Minor was overrun, and by 1080 the old Byzantine army had all but ceased to exist. On this day in history, August 27th, 1689, the Treaty of Nerchinsk is signed by Russia and the Qing Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Nerchinsk, a town of Asiatic Russia in the Sretensk district of the Far Eastern area, in latitude 52 degrees, 10 minutes north, longitude 116 degrees, 32 minutes east, on the left bank of the Nercha, 2.5 miles above its confluence with the Shilka. Population from 1926, 6,545. It is a center for the collection of furs, cattle, and brick tea from China, and for the distribution of manufactured goods imported from industrial Russia. There are tanneries, candle factories, and a fur coat factory. The town is a market for the agricultural products of the fertile river valley. The fort dates from 1654, and the town was founded in 1658. By Pashkov, who in that year opened direct communication between the Russian settlements in Transbaikalia and those on the Amur, which had been founded by Cossacks and fur traders coming from the Yakutsk region. In 1689 was signed between Russia and China the Treaty of Nerchinsk, which stopped for 2 centuries the further advance of the Russians into the basin of the Amur. After that, Nerchinsk became the chief center for the trade with China. The opening of the western route through Mongolia by Urga and the establishment of a custom house at Kaikata in 1728 diverted this trade into a new channel, but Nerchinsk acquired fresh importance from the influx of immigrants into eastern Transbaikalia, the discovery of rich mines, and the arrival of a great number of convicts. In 1812, it was transferred from the banks of the Shilka to its present site. On this day in history, August 28, 1521, as part of the Ottoman Wars in Europe, the Ottoman Turks occupy Belgrade. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the city. Belgrade, or in Serbian, Beograd, i.e., White Castle. The capital of Yugoslavia. Population 266,849. Belgrade occupies a triangular foreland at the confluence of the Sava and Danube. At the base stands Avila Hill, the last outpost of the Rudnik Mountains, and at the apex a cliff 200 feet high, crowned by the citadel, once white, but now maroon with age, used as a prison and barracks. Behind the citadel are the beautiful gardens of Kalmegdan, with a famous river view, and behind them the city of white houses. It was formerly divided into the Old Town, the Russian Town, Sava Makala, or Sava District, and the Turkish Town, Dorkol, or Crossroad. Changes in the 19th century made the old divisions less clear, and there grew the Terazia, a suburb along the aqueduct, or Terazi. A few old plastered Turkish houses with red-tiled roofs are left among the insanitary riverside districts, but after 1869 Belgrade was rapidly transformed into a modern European town with wide streets, electric tramways, electric lighting, telegraphs, and telephones, while in the beginning of the 20th century wireless was installed. Belgrade is the seat of the Metropolitan of Serbia, with a cathedral. In addition to the university, with 4 faculties, educational facilities are afforded by a military academy, a theological seminary, a commercial academy, and several secondary schools. The Court of Cassation sits at Belgrade, and also a Court of Appeal and a commercial tribunal. There is a fine monument of Prince Michael, 1860-68, a royal palace, much enlarged in 1925, an interesting national museum, a national library with a wealth of old Serbian monuments, a national theater, a botanical garden, rich in Balkan flora, and a parliament house. Commercial institutions include a chamber of commerce and many trade associations, and a national bank, privileged to issue notes. The bulk of the foreign trade of Serbia finds its way through Belgrade, and the town itself is engaged in brewing, iron founding, and the manufacture of cloth, woolen goods, boots, glue, sugar, soap, pottery, preserved meat, and confectionery. Belgrade is near good coal supplies, and in the neighborhood are lead mines and quarries with excellent building stone and beautiful marbles. The main railway line of Yugoslavia runs north to meet the Hungarian line to Budapest, and south through Niš and Skopje to join the Greek line to Salonika. It has many branches and is connected with the Adriatic ports Split and Sebenik. The only high roads are one going north to Smederevo and one south to Kataro, all the others being merely country roads. South of the town is the park of Topčider, with an old Turkish kiosk built for Prince Miloš, 1818-39. In the adjoining forest of lime trees, called Kushnotjuk, or the Deer Park, Prince Michael was assassinated in 1868. Opposite the citadel, across the Danube, lies the town of Semlin, which was Hungarian until 1918. For administrative purposes, Belgrade forms a separate department of the kingdom. The first fortification was made by Celts in the 3rd century BC, with the name Singid Onum, by which it was known until the 7th century AD. The Romans took it from the Celts and replaced their fort by a regular Roman castrum. Between the 4th and 6th centuries AD, it often changed masters: Huns, Sarmatians, Goths, Gepids. Then the Emperor Justinian made it Roman once more. Towards the end of the 8th century, it was taken by the Franks of Charlemagne. In the 9th century, by the Bulgarians, who held it till the beginning of the 11th century, when the Byzantine Emperor, Basil II, reconquered it for the Greek Empire. The Hungarians, under King Stephen, took it from the Greeks in 1124. From that time, it was again constantly changing hands, Greeks, Bulgarians, Hungarians replacing each other in turn. The city was considered to be the key of Hungary and of Serbia also, besides giving command of traffic between the upper and lower Danube. It has, in consequence, seen more battles under its walls than most fortresses in Europe. The Turks used to call it Dar-o-i-Jihad, the home of wars of the faith. During the 14th century, it was in the hands of the Serbian kings, and was made capital of Serbia in 1403 by Stephen, grandson of Prince Lazar. His successor, George Branković, ceded it to the Hungarians in 1427. From 1521 to 1688 it was in Turkish hands, and again from 1739 to 1789, when the Austrians carried it by assault and lost it again in 1792. In 1807, the Serbians, having risen for their independence, took the town and held it until the end of September 1813. Up to 1862, the fortresses and the Danubian slope of the town were inhabited by Turks, living under special Turkish administration, while the modern part of the city, the plateau of the ridge and the western slope, was inhabited by Serbians living under their own authorities. This dual government was a constant cause of friction between the Serbians and the Turks, and on occasion of one conflict between the two parties, the Turkish commander of the fortress bombarded the Serbian part of the town, June 1862, which indirectly led, in 1866, to the withdrawal of the Turkish garrison from the citadel and its delivery to the Serbians. In 1878, by the Treaty of Berlin, Belgrade became the capital of a Serbia freed at last from Turkish suzerainty. World War I began with the bombardment of Belgrade by the Austrians on July 29, 1914. In November, it was taken by the Austro-Germans, but the Serbs made a brilliant return, and in December, King Peter made a triumphant entry into his capital. In September 1915, a general attack was made by the Austrians and Germans on the river frontier, and on October 9th, the town fell. It remained in enemy hands until the end of the war, when the Kingdom of Yugoslavia came into existence. In April 1941, when the Axis invaded Yugoslavia, Belgrade was heavily bombed and was occupied by the Germans. On this day in history, August 29th, 1261, Pope Urban IV succeeds Pope Alexander IV, becoming the 182nd Pope. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Pope Urban IV. Jacques Pantaleon, Pope from August 29, 1261 to October 2, 1264, was the son of a shoemaker of Troyes. Having received a monastic education, he became Archdeacon of Liege and Papal Legate of Innocent IV to Poland and Prussia. He was consecrated Bishop of Verdun in 1253, and 2 years later was translated to the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. He was on a visit to Italy when he was elected to succeed Alexander IV in the Holy See. He spent most of his pontificate at Orvieto. Under him began the preponderance of the French in the Curia, which later led to the papal residence at Avignon, and indirectly to the Great Schism. In 1264 he instituted the festival of Corpus Christi. He favored the claim of Charles of Anjou to the crown of the Two Sicilies. Urban died before the arrival of Charles of Anjou, and was succeeded by Pope Clement IV. On this day in history, August 30th, 1464, Pope Paul II succeeds Pope Pius II as the 211th Pope. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Paul. Paul II, Pietro Barbo, Pope from August 30th, 1464 to July 26th, 1471, was born at Venice in 1417. He was made cardinal priest of Santa Cecilia, then of St. Marco by Nicholas V, was a favorite of Calixtus III, and was unanimously and unexpectedly elected the successor of Pius II. He immediately declared that election capitulations, which cardinals had long been in the habit of affirming as rules of conduct for future popes, could affect a new pope only as counsels, not as binding obligations. He opposed the domineering policy of the Venetian government in Italian affairs. His repeated condemnations of the pragmatic sanction of Borgias resulted in strained relations with Louis XI of France. He pronounced excommunication and deposition against King George Podiebrad on December 23, 1466, for a refusal to enforce the Basel Agreement against the Uchuquists, and prevailed on Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary, to declare war against him on March 31, 1468. Matthias was not particularly successful, but George Podiebrad died on March 22, 1471. The Pope carried on fruitless negotiations, 1469, with the Emperor Frederick III for a crusade against the Turks. Paul endeavored to make drastic reforms in the Curia, and abolished the College of Abbreviators, 1466. He suppressed the Roman Academy, but on religious grounds. On the other hand, he was friendly to Christian scholars. He restored many ancient monuments, made a magnificent collection of antiquities and works of art, built the Palazzo di St. Marco, now the Palazzo de Venezia, and probably first introduced printing into Rome. He began in 1469 a revision of the Roman Statutes of 1363, a work which was not completed until 1490. Paul established the special tax called the Quindenium in 1470, and by bull of the same year, April 19th, announced the Jubilee for every 25 years. He began negotiations with Ivan III for the union of the Russian Church with the Roman See. He died on July 26, 1471, and was succeeded by Sixtus IV. On this day in history, August 31st, 1776, William Livingston, the first governor of New Jersey, begins serving his first term. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the governor. William Livingston, born 1723, died 1790, American political leader, was born at Albany, New York, probably on November 30th, 1723. He was the son of Philip Livingston, 1686 to 1749, and grandson of Robert Livingston, 1654 to 1725, an important figure in the early life of the New York State. William Livingston graduated at Yale College in 1741, studied law in the city of New York, was admitted to the bar in 1748, and served in the New York legislature 1759 to 60. However, his chief political influence was exerted through pamphlets and newspaper articles. Through the Independent Reflector, which he established in 1752, Livingston fought the attempt to bring the projected King's College, now Columbia University, under the control of the Church of England. Upon the suspension of the Reflector in 1753, he edited the New York Mercury, the Watchtower section, 1754 to 55, which became the organ of the Presbyterian faction. In 1772, he removed to Elizabeth, New Jersey. He represented New Jersey in the First and Second Continental Congress, 1774 and 1775 to 76. But left Philadelphia in June 1776, probably to avoid voting on the question of adopting the Declaration of Independence, which he regarded as inexpedient. He was chosen first governor of the state of New Jersey in 1778 and was regularly re-elected until his death at Elizabeth, New Jersey, on July 25, 1790. Livingston was a delegate to the Federal Constitutional Convention of 1787 and supported the New Jersey Small State Plan. In 1754, he joined with his brother Philip and the others in founding what is now known as the Society Library of New York. With the help of William Smith, 1728 to 93, the New York historian William Livingston prepared a digest of the laws of New York for the period 1691 to 1756, which was published in 2 volumes, 1752 and 1762.